What is going on? I've got this question in my head and I'm trying to figure out a logical solution or answer to it, and I'm struggling. What is this escalation we've seen over the last week or so in Europe and from NATO and from a number of European nations? This messaging that NATO needs to be ready for war, and soon. If you haven't already detected and seen this, there have been articles coming out of Sweden where their military commander-in-chief, General Michael Biden, has said that all Swedes should mentally prepare for war. And this is as Sweden is moving towards NATO, being included in NATO. We have reports coming out of Germany where they are talking about the fact that the country needs to be ready for war. NATO needs to prepare, that they've got 5 to 8 years at the max before they need to be ready to fight Russia. Poland, there's reports of a document having been released or leaked which says that the Polish analysis is that it's less than that. It's 36 months before NATO and Poland needs to be ready to go to war with Russia. Even in the UK, in the UK, there's a Daily Mail article which I discussed earlier this week. Big front page picture on the website, talking about how Russia will strike all the civilian capitals. Pictures of missiles landing civilian sites, London and Paris and Helsinki. How Russia's going to send a fleet of AI tanks westward to capture Europe. NATO's military commander Rob Bauer came out and said, you better prepare, you better get torches and water and batteries and things ready. Yesterday, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has released a video on X, formerly Twitter, where he's saluting the camera and pretending to be signing on in response to the British General Patrick Sanders' recent talks, where he's been effectively hinting at the fact that UK needs to prepare for war. There are articles coming out again that everyone needs to prepare for military service. Conscription will be coming back again, hinting at that. Of course, the UK Defence Ministry has come out and said, oh, no, there'll be no conscription required. But Boris Johnson is there on this video encouraging younger Britons to consider the attractiveness of military support. So something's going on here. We've got NATO about to kick off Steadfast Defender, which is its largest military exercises ever. 90,000 NATO troops will be descending upon the Baltics, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Germany and Poland, in that area, all's nicely wrapped around Kaliningrad, that little Russian oblast, just to increase the pressure, the tension as they conduct war games, which will see them enacting and working through the scenario of them fighting with Russia. In the Baltic Sea, there's going to be a whole heap of NATO ships and things rolling around, aircraft carriers, there'll be hundreds of aircraft, jets and that sort of thing. This is not something which you would call a de-escalation in the conflict with Russia at the moment. Maria Zakharova, the Director for Information and Press Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Russia, she has come out and said that this is risky. What NATO is doing by conducting these exercises on the border with Russia and Belarus at this time just runs the risk of something going wrong and launching Europe and NATO into a conflict. You may be aware of NATO Article 5. NATO Article 5 is this piece of their NATO agreement, which says an attack upon one NATO nation is to be considered an attack upon all NATO nations, and all NATO nations can then respond to that attack. So this is one of the benefits that NATO has at the moment of having Ukraine fight this proxy war for them and for Ukraine not being a NATO nation. It means that NATO doesn't need to act upon Article 5. As someone commented to me yesterday, Article 5 isn't a mandate. It doesn't mean that if Russia were to attack a NATO nation, that they must all join together and respond. But if they don't, and if they don't for a long period of time, it makes NATO look weak. It makes it look as though, well, what's the point of Article 5? So there is this risk at the moment that if these exercises went wrong and somehow something happened and Belarus or Russia struck one of the NATO nations involved, NATO's at the position then where it should enact Article 5. And if it doesn't, as I say, it looks weak. So this is risky. If it does and it tries to respond, then suddenly we are in World War III. You've got Russia taking on all of the NATO nations. NATO doesn't appear ready for this right now. They are struggling to produce artillery shells to enable Ukraine to be able to fight. Ukraine's firing somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 shells a day at the moment, which seems to be about a 10th or a 20th of what the Russians are firing. In some reporting I covered off a week or so ago, basically if you go and look through the Western reports of the number of shells being fired by the Russians, from about September last year, I think it was peaking. Some days the Russians were firing 60,000 high explosive 155mm rounds per day, 60,000, getting down to 20,000. You look at reports from November, the Russians are firing 20,000. You look at reports from early January, the Russians are firing 20,000. They seem to be consistently firing 20,000 rounds a day. The Ukrainians have dropped from September, they were maybe reaching up to 9,000, then November it's 6,000 to 7,000, and now in January they're down to 1,000 to 2,000. They're rationing shells and they're just not getting them. Germany's announced an aid package yesterday where they're going to provide 230,000 pieces of ammunition to Ukraine. But given that announcement from Germany does not strictly specify that these are 155mm rounds, I'm fairly certain that this will be a grab bag of different types of ammunition. Collectively, there'll be 230,000 pieces, but the ones that they really want are those high explosive 155mm rounds, and they're just not getting those. So NATO isn't able to stock its proxy, Ukraine, sufficiently to allow it to take on and win this conflict and push Russia back. Now, of course, when all the NATO nations join together, you've got a lot more capability. You've got long-range missiles, so suddenly Russia will start to suffer. Russia will start to now be being struck in Moscow and deeper than that at its repair and assembly facilities in the same way that Ukraine is being struck now. But so will the NATO nations. Suddenly, the UK will be screaming about the fact that it has had factories destroyed and some civilians in the UK have been killed. And this will happen in Germany and Poland and in all of the NATO nations. So, this is a tit-for-tat scenario. Just because NATO will be able to inflict more damage on Russia, Russia will be able to inflict damage on them. And the outcome of a conflict between NATO and Russia is something that, just looking at what's happening in Ukraine and looking at any previous war, is something to be strongly avoided. NATO doesn't want, regardless of whether they're capable of beating Russia, they don't want a fight with Russia. Give me one good reason why they would want to move from a position today where they could be trading economically with Russia, growing their economies, to one where their economies are going to be struggling to some extent. They are going to be suffering military damage to their own nations. Their politicians will be playing a very dicey game, hoping that public opinion is on their side and that everyone supports them in the war effort, and hope that it's not turning against them when they will rapidly lose their positions. And this last point is one thing that I'm kind of thinking might be why we're seeing some of this activity going on at the moment. Maybe this is political positioning at the moment to make these nations look tough. And it's obviously there too. This propaganda is to prepare these European nations. And the reason I say it is propaganda is because the one thing that's missing from this whole story of the fact that NATO needs to go to war with Russia, remember that NATO is a defensive pact. It's not an offensive one. It's meant to be a defensive pact, is that Russia is giving no indication that it wants to fight NATO. Now, if you say that's complete bullshit, then I ask you to comment and provide to me your strong evidence that suggests that Russia has been planning to fight NATO and has been building up capability to fight NATO. And I would particularly say to show any evidence of this prior to 2022. I mean, now you can say, oh, the Russians are doing that. Well, yeah, the Russians are on a war footing now because they have been forced into a conflict with Ukraine. And of course, they understand that NATO could join Ukraine, or Ukraine could be brought into NATO, and that would mean that they would have to fight NATO. But there's no evidence that this is what Russia is seeking or that what Russia was planning to do. And there are far smarter people than me saying this. You go and watch some of John Mearsheimer. He has great thought, experience, and a wealth of information talking about this. Go and look on YouTube for John Mearsheimer and watch some of his recent interviews and debates. And he openly asks for people to provide the evidence indicating that Russia has at any stage looked to engage in a fight with NATO or looks to even take Ukraine. The initial engagement with Russia into Ukraine was not intended to take Ukraine. It was intended to force Zelensky's regime to sign an agreement to say, we will remain neutral, we will stay out of NATO, and the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic can become independent if that's what they want, and yes, Crimea is yours. It would have ended about there. Now the tables have turned after nearly 2 years of fighting and an understanding that Zelensky won't negotiate. Now Russia is applying pressure and they will, I imagine, take all of the oblasts to the east of the Dnieper River, including Odessa and Mykolaiv, because it makes sense to restrict what remains of Ukraine from that port access. I think that's just general basic military strategic common sense that you would look to do that. But that is a change in the Russian goals and policy because of the way that President Zelensky of Ukraine decided not to sign the agreements that were apparently had almost pen to paper with Russia back in March and April of 2022, and instead side with Boris Johnson. Watching Boris Johnson's recent video on X, and having just seen him in the past, I have to wonder what Zelensky was thinking to trust that guy. Maybe it's just me and I don't see the intellectual depth that Boris has. But anyhow, different topic. So Russia's not looking for this fight. And this comes out, if you go and actually watch what they are saying, when I say they, go and see the reports from Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. See the reports and things that President Putin himself says. See what Maria Zakharova is saying, and actually listen and read to what they are saying, and then go and listen and read to what the Swedish military, the British military, the German and Polish military, and NATO themselves are saying. And you can see who is promoting this conflict and building this conflict. It's very clear that it's the West that is looking for this. NATO says to prepare for war, but why? Because Russia isn't driving it. So I've been trying to think, why is this happening? Is this simply, have we reached the time in human civilization where the Western military industrial complex, maybe the elites in the World Economic Forum who have their desires to depopulate the earth, and in particular, it seems in the West for some reason, is have we just reached the point where they just have gained enough power now that they are able to induce this type of conflict? They're able to induce NATO to get into a fight with Russia, which Russia doesn't want, which NATO doesn't want, probably before NATO is prepared, which will just lead to a lot of death and suffering through Europe, and most likely wider. If NATO gets into a fight with Russia, then I think it is very likely that the likes of Iran and Turkey will side with Russia, and that conflict will extend all the way down into the Middle East, and Israel will find itself then consumed in a massive conflagration, with the US trying to support, while also trying to support a deeper, wider fight in Europe. It just turns out badly. But maybe that's it, because who's the winner in that scenario? The winner is, the military war machine. The companies that produce weapons, they win. They get billions, if not trillions of dollars turned towards them. And the rough part of it is that those billions and trillions of dollars that the West will be supplying there are coming from the civilians who are now being sent to war. It's coming from the taxpayers, is who will be paying for those weapons. And things don't have to be this way. They really don't. You don't have to have a war like this. But we could be headed that way. And as I say, it's the why. Now, I came up with an idea of what this might be, and I've put a link in the description if you want to go and watch that video where I talk specifically about that. And in this theory that I have here is that this comes from the question that many people ask is, why hasn't NATO got into this fight and beaten Russia? Why haven't they given long-range missiles to Russia? Why haven't they all just banded together, put Ukraine into NATO, and in 6 months just gone and flattened Russia, which, it sounded like the goal. My crazy idea was that maybe at a strategic level, there are still some adults in the room in the US at a higher level, and someone's thinking long term. Now, I'm not saying this is what should happen. I'm saying maybe someone's thinking long term, and they've recognized that Russia is not the real competitor with America, but China is the real competitor with America. And that's a position that a lot of American politicians and people have in America, military have. And there's good reason to consider that is where the likely real peer competitor conflict could come in the future. China is a massive economy. It's a massive country, growing economically and militarily. So maybe someone looked at this and said, well, in the long run, how would we like to fight China? Now, we like to use proxies, don't we? Well, we could use Russia as a proxy against China. But if we look at Russia at the end of 2021, the start of 2022, well, Russia's not that strong an opponent if we were to try to induce them somehow as a proxy to fight China. Okay, so what if we stirred them up? What if we basically said, okay, we want to have a bit of a war with Russia, but we'll do it with a proxy of Ukraine, and we won't run this war too hot. We don't really want to beat Russia. What we want to do is stimulate Russia. We want to threaten and scare Russia enough that they will adopt a war footing, which is what they've done. A lot of domestic investment now from the oligarchs who can't put their money overseas anymore in the West. They're now injecting that into Russia. Russia's suffering from its biggest skilled labour shortage apparently that's ever had. Its unemployment is incredibly low because everyone's working in the war effort at the moment. And Russia's capability and strength as a military nation has grown massively in the last 2 years. So again, it's like 2-4D for what's really happening. It's simpler than that. It might just be the military war machine, but you could suggest that a couple of years of that, of scaring Russia to really get bristly as a military nation, if you could then induce a conflict between a strong Russia and China, that would weaken China. It would weaken Russia, but we know, the West in military terms, it's not concerned about using nations as proxies to fight a war. So the US builds Russia through a few years of limited conflict via Ukraine, builds them up, and of course this strengthens the relationships between Russia and China. I'm not denying that. We're seeing that already. But Russia and China share a border. So as Russia is growing in military strength, China is keeping one eye very closely on Russia because they're the neighbour. And now it's good to have a strong neighbour, but if your neighbour starts to get too strong, suddenly you start to get a little worried. So there's always going to be that element of concern for China as Russia is growing militarily. Now, if the CIA decides that it's time to weaken Russia before the US wants to fight Russia, so here I'm talking years down the track from now, they might look at some means of triggering a conflict between Russia and China. And there are many ways to do that sort of thing. They could send insurgents in there to start skirmishes and fights. They could pay people off. They could organize, small, like a small coup in an area. They can pay people to change their allegiance and do things. They can flood the world with rhetoric that all they're hearing on their military communication channels is that Russia's looking to start a fight with China. This could be engineered. And if it were engineered, then the US moves from a position where it has been stoking a fight with Ukraine and Russia and building Russia up so that Russia can now engage China and have a few years of that. And the two of them degrade one another over a 3 or 4 year war. And the US sits back and lets that happen and builds its power. And the US ends up again being the global power, which it once was, but which it is slipping away from being at the moment. Now, I'm not saying this is what the US should do, that they should be the global power. I'm saying this is what could be happening. This is what, if I was the United States and wanted to be the global power, well, to me, if I look at the current situation, how I would turn it into a win, that's what I would be looking at doing. And seeing how, as there are people, no doubt, paid by the US to think about these things years ahead and who are more smarter than I am about this type of thing, I wouldn't be surprised if someone's come up with that idea and said, we could do this. It would look like we were warring with Russia. Really, we're building them up to war with China. Maybe, I don't know. But something's going on. NATO's saying prepare for war, and we need to know why. All right, I'm going to leave that there. I'll come back with another video, hopefully later today, on a general update, but this one's just going around in my head, so I'd love some thoughts and comments on this. I'm on Twitter now too. I'm on X now too. You can find the Deep 404 there. So, if you're on X, let's chat there.